Taking this further is the next panel, which is digital transformation dimension. I invite the moderator, Mr. Akhilesh Tuteja, who is the global head, cybersecurity consulting and India head digital consulting, KPMG. He has advised over 200 clients on matters relating to cybersecurity, IT strategy, selection of technologies, and help them realize the business benefits of technology. He's also played an active part in developing security and privacy frameworks for the banking industry in India. We have most of the panelists with us, Akhilesh, and with this, I invite you to kindly take over, introduce the panelists, and proceed with the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Bhushan, for that lovely introduction. I must say that the previous session, which I just attended, was truly fascinating, set the right stage, and partly makes me speechless because a number of topics which have been covered are so broad and wide. And I'm personally thankful to Dr. Rai for having spent time with us. And I heard Shubhi considers him as an institution. Maybe I can join the fan club. So thank you, Shubhi. And my biggest thanks to Mr. Samir. I think he's the one magician which brings lots of actors together. So thank you, Samir, for putting me in the company of some of those best people in this space. So thank you so much. With that, let me just start to introduce a very vast and very wide-ranging panel of experts. Each of them come with a very different perspective and very rich and diverse thought processes. I have a stroke of luck in some ways to have people who represent the government, people who represent the industry body, and also people who represent the provider community. So in no particular order, let me first introduce Mr. G.T. Venkateshwara Rao. I think we have you there, sir. I don't see you on camera, but Mr. Venkateshwara Rao, he has held various positions in income tax department assessment, investigation, intelligence, and was the first officer from IT department to be posted as the first Secretary Economics in the High Commission of India in Singapore during the last decade. He's worked extensively on data mining, data analytics on a very large database, and pioneered the concept of data mining in both electronic service delivery and income tax department. It's my pleasure. I'm sure Mr. Venkateshwara Rao will join us very soon. Thank you so much for being with us on the panel today. The next on, I have the pleasure of inviting and introducing dear friend, Vishal Jain. I see Vishal on camera. Vishal is a joint managing director of Inspira Enterprise, an enterprise which has grown leaps and bounds in a short period of time. Vishal founded Inspira about 9 or 10 years ago. Inspira specializes in many aspects, especially in the area of threat hunting, threat intel, and cyber response. He was the first one to launch the Global Security Operations Center to provide end-to-end security solution at an affordable cost. He's helped small and medium enterprises to develop customized yet cost-effective solutions to protect their business from cyber vulnerabilities. He has the expertise of working with banking, finance, defense, healthcare, oil and gas, and many other public sectors. I'm sure Vishal will benefit from your extensive knowledge of working in the area of public policy as well as in implementing effective security solutions. Thank you very much for joining us and welcome to the panel.
Thank you.
Next on, I have the pleasure of inviting and introducing Mr. Kumar Vineet, who's the Special Secretary, Department of IT and Electronics, Uttar Pradesh. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for joining. As a brief introduction, Mr. Kumar is the Special Secretary and the Managing Director of Uttar Pradesh Development System Corporation Limited. I don't know, they pronounce it as UP DESCO, that's what I thought it is. He's guided several projects, including e-tendering, and created an ecosystem for startups, and has worked extensively on electronic manufacturing policy in the state. So again, privileged to have Mr. Kumar. Somebody like him can guide us as we navigate through the process of building policies for data protection. Next on, I have again the pleasure of introducing Dr. Shubhi Chaturvedi. For those of you who are carrying on with us from the previous session, need no introduction because even if you would have heard her introduction, she would have exceeded that through her thoughts. but I'll just take a brief introduction. Dr. Shubhi is a distinguished public policy professional and chair of CAII Committee on Creator Experience, Economy, and Gaming. If I were to read her profile, I think we will finish an hour, but I'll still say at a high level, she's been at the front and center of the most pressing development debates of the time, from the digital economy, entrepreneurship, and startups to diversity and sustainability. She has recommended as part of the committee under METI that the private cloud could be used by the state and public sector. And at the same time, she's also the global co-chair of NetMundil initiative on the boards of UK India Business Council, UKIBC, and IGFSA, and as a member of UN Internet Governance Forum. And she was appointed by the UNSG. Congratulations, I think that's a big laurel. She currently serves as the chair for FICCI's Committee on Women in Technology, Policy, and Leadership. Thank you very much, Shubhi, for spending longest time with us today. I'm looking forward to our conversation. Last but not the least, I have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Anil Bhardwaj. I think I see Mr. Bhardwaj here. His name is, he's representing FISME, as you can see, he's the Secretary General of Federation of Indian MSMEs. Mr. Bhardwaj has worked extensively in the fields of international trade and SME development. He's advised several SME development projects, including multilateral and bilateral donor agencies in India. Some of his engagements include being member of Damodaran Committee for Reforming and Regulatory Environment for Doing Business in India under Ministry of Corporate Affairs, member being the drafting committee for National Voluntary Guidelines on Social, Environmental, and Economic Responsibilities of Business, since notified by, again, MCA, Government of India. Welcome, Mr. Bhardwaj. Thank you very much for joining us today. Yet again, I'm looking for a very wide and diverse perspectives from you. All right, so that's really luminaries I've got today here. I wish we were all sitting together in the room and had the pleasure of company, but nevertheless, virtual makes it as good. What I'm going to do it is to make sure that we bring the best of what each one of us can contribute here, because as you can imagine, the range which I'm dealing with is quite vast, and it might be impossible for me to get everything, every aspect from all the people which you got. But before we get on, and I request each of my fellow panelists to share their thoughts, and I'm sure you will feel great about it. I'll tell you what I'm here about today. First and foremost, I'm a consultant. So the good thing which a consultant does is that hardly adds any value. Ask 5 people, find an opinion, and serve that to everybody. So I'm going to do the same, hoping to add very little value from my side, but get the best from everybody. I might also do the job of a traffic havaldar, if you like that, because we got 5 people and I got a time limit of an hour. So I would request everybody to be brief. But if you're not, I can tell you, only for today, I've been given immunity to control the conversation. So that's my second rather non-value adding subject matter job. But having said that, the topic of data protection, cybersecurity, and in the context, this panel is talking about in the context of digital transformation, is something very close to my heart. So I'll try and share some of my initial thinking and generally posing questions rather than giving answers, because I'm hoping this time I'll request answer from some of my fellow panelists. So when I think about a topic like this, which is public policy in an area relating to technology, I kind of get reminded of a movie which I think some of you would have watched, based on a novel written by Chetan Bhagat called Two States. And when I look at the policy making in digital transformation stage, I can't but compare that, it's like saying, there are people who are the policy makers, and then there are people who build technology. They kind of represent to me the Northern India and the Southern India concept to me. They all have great qualities, they all have great thinking, but sometimes their thoughts are different. They look at things from a different perspective. They are not made of the same soil, but they have to come together and hopefully get married and work together. So just to give you my high level view of what I think, that why I think the policy making and technology are at the 2 extremes of a spectrum. The first one is that the technology is all about agility, and policy making is all about doing something which lasts for a longer time. So how do you kind of bring them together? Where somebody is saying, I want to build something so that I can break it tomorrow. And somebody says, I want to build something which lasts my lifetime. So that's one big controversy in saying, is it being built in an agile manner, or is it being built in a sustainable manner? The second contrast which I see when I look at technology and policy making is some sort of authority imbalance. So when it comes to policy making, who's the person who make the senior most person makes the change? And when it comes to technology, let me tell you that while the people who are sitting at the top chairs might think that they make the change, the real change in technology happens at possibly the lowest level. So there's a big change, big thinking about who actually makes the change, the person who's got the highest experience or the person who's got the lowest experience. In fact, in my view, having more experience in technology makes you rather useless because you're a little bit far away from dealing with what's coming next. You're also conditioned about what you've dealt with it and all that. So to me, policy making and technology are at some level two ends of the spectrum, but they all come together, and all of that is important. So that's my first point. My second point is that the way technology is moving, it is becoming very hard for us to put dimensions to this. So let me just take you back into the history, and I'm going back maybe about 100 years. What happened about 100 years ago is the mankind invented something very path-breaking, and that was electricity. So it was the time when the Teslas and the Edisons of this world came up with the electrification. And I think that electrification did something to the industrial revolution, what today's technology is doing in the form of digital, to the same thing. And when electricity was first brought in, did we try to regulate the electricity, or did we try to first use the electricity? I think it went through the same. So if you actually read the history about 100 years ago, it's kind of gone through the same phenomena. So the people who at that point in time were the most learned were the ones who were actually building, whether it should be the alternate current or the direct current, and there was a big fight going on at that point in time, versus how do you apply it. And then there were people saying, hey, it's got a huge risk of electrocution, so I'm not going to put electricity in my plant. So that's the kind of thing which you're saying now. Any new technology which comes in creates its own imbalance. And the third point I will make is that when we talk about policy making for data protection and in the context of digital transformation, in my view, the biggest challenge which you have is that, what layer are we talking about? Because it could be about storing data for a transactional system, which I think could be rather easy. And I think we are spending a lot of time about that, saying, okay, you can keep this data with consent for the purpose which you've done it, all that, maybe makes sense. But when you get a little bit down on how technology is using the data, one of the biggest use case of today's data is using smart decision making. So AI. So how do you apply the data protection concept in the world of AI, where AI is actually going to make decisions based on the data, and that quality of the data and consent of the data kind of makes a difference. So when AI makes decisions, so I'm no longer talking about the transaction, but I'm talking about the AI. The second part is when the machines make actions. So the IoTs of this world, for example, in a couple of years down the line, my car might actually just go out and fill itself from a gas station and pay for itself. Now, at that point in time, the decisions which are made by my car and the data which my car uses at that point in time, what happens to those things? How about identity? And third one is we are also seeing data protection issues emerging in the really new path-breaking technology like gene editing. So what happens to the data for those kinds of things? So yes, transactional systems look easy, but I'm the person who always look further up, not 5 years, but maybe 10 years. So I just thought with this kind of context, I'm going to bring all of these things together with the expertise which you got here today in the room. So in no particular order, I just think that, I'm going to first invite nobody but Mr. Kumar. And Mr. Kumar, this is the question to you. I know. How do you see the technology and policy coming together? Do you think that that's an area where a marriage is easier possible than done, or what are your thoughts around that?
Thank you, Mr. Akhilesh. And that was really a wonderful comment from you, covering the entire perspective of the today's discussion. Well, I was just going through one of the, before I just answer to your question specifically, I was just going through one of a research scholar, Dr. Ansuya Nain's public policy formulation in India topic. It was a very beautiful line written on it. We are a country full of paradoxes, and public policy is not just a public policy, but it is an amalgam of two components, that is public and policy, where public policy framework actually imbibes into its sphere these demands, and then how these resultant policies are churned out of administrative machinery. So the demand of public churning out of the administrative machinery, that was really a beautiful connotation I was just going through a few days ago. I thought I should mention it in this particular session. Yes, but as you said that our data protection issues that I was just hearing about, and public policy per se, as per the Department of Uttar Pradesh IT department is concerned, we have got a few policies that we are looking into, and we are trying to get into the entire sphere of amalgamation of public policy, protection, cyber security. These three have to get into a single platform, and of course in juxtaposition with each other, because none of them can work in its own individual identity. So we have got many policies, we have got many issues that we are coming up. In fact, even today we are going to analyze this startup policy today evening itself and come up with something new that can help out the instrumentation in promoting the issues that are coming up with the startups. So we need to change, we need to continuously evolve, and to develop the entire scenario into such a process where we can get up into a good administrative system which really understands the demand of private sector and get into the process of actually delivering, which is something useful. So just I create an iconic cyber security policy will not do. Just I create a data security policy without I being able to understand will not be able to deliver. For example, for me, CCTV is a very important issue that should be here. In London, there was a what should I say? There was a movement against CCTV that in Soho in particular, that this is my house. Why should you define who is going to enter into my house, and why you should be aware of who is going to enter into my house? So remove the CCTV in front of my house, which is in a public domain. So it is subjective, but ultimately our public policy, our administrative acumen, our administrative system has to come out together to form something that is deliverable in the environment in which we are living in. Talking about Uttar Pradesh per se, we have our policy on various administrative norms. Particularly if I talk about IT department or IT sector and IT and electronics, we have our electronics manufacturing, our state data center, and our startup policies to highlight. Startup policy is always there, and it is coming up beautifully in Uttar Pradesh, and some are very good examples of startup what should I say, their success stories are also coming up, and that is really very nice. So to conclude along with that, I would say that policy and administrative machinery has to go in tandem along with the private industry, which is actually the backbone of the entire system. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kumar. I think I like your point that working in tandem is the way. Let me invite Dr. Shubhi to talk about some of her perspectives on this topic.
Thank you so much, Akhilesh. It's such an honor to share the panel with people who are like-minded and so empowered and erudite. Vineetji, a very, very special thank you to you for making time to be on the panel. I am from Lucknow. I grew up in Lucknow. I read at Loreto. It is so heartening for us to see people sitting in those chairs who understand not just policy formulation, but put at the center of the context public interest and with due public consultation. तो बहुत special धन्यवाद आपको for making time for us and making us believe in a system where all of us are ready to work with the government. Akhilesh, this is where my intervention really lies. When we look at digital transformation for a country like India, and in the panel in the morning today, when we were setting the stage for today's deliberations, I'd mentioned that what is it that we're trying to solve for? Because in India, you're not just looking at one India, there are many Indias. And like we said, how do you make this journey possible? As our Honorable Prime Minister likes to say, Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. And that is not just a statement. It is a war cry for many of us who believe in the promise that India holds. I want to take a step back and say, when we're looking at a system like data protection and privacy, it's really not an end in itself. It is a means to an end. And digital transformation is at heart of what we're solving for. So when we work with governments, the ask is really simple. Can you give us policies which are stable, which are predictable, that we can engage with, which are pro-investment, and that allow for windows of disruption, and that allows for creation of regulatory sandboxes where startups such as ours or companies such as ours that are trying to base in India and solve for the world, or are global entities that were originated in India but have now gone to become really big in the world and yet want to continue to live in this ecosystem. So how do we build for that? There are many things that have happened across the world, but the India story is unique because the digital transformation has single-handedly been powered by the state. There is a visionary program that this government came up with, and we know it now as Digital India. In June 2021, earlier this year, we celebrated and marked the 6th anniversary. So here are some of the key things that have happened. This program based itself on 9 pillars. And they've thought of almost everything. It's brilliant in the way it is unfolded, whether it is looking at technology, whether it is looking at critical infrastructure, whether it is looking at now building e-services online, whether it is now empowering citizens to engage with that ecosystem. You will be amazed to know the credo behind our ministry, Ministry of IT and Electronics, is actually power to empower. And if that alone becomes the central thesis of what we're trying to solve for as a panel, we're on the right track. Will we take a little longer than the others if we want to get there? There is an Egyptian proverb: if you travel alone, you travel fast, but if you travel together, you travel far. And that's really the intent. It's going to be a difficult process. As Amartya Sen puts it, we're argumentative Indians. We have a worldview, we have opinions, but do we have the patience to build consensus? When I was serving my term, as you mentioned earlier, I co-chaired the Net Mundial, and this was one of the biggest. Net Mundial literally translates into the World Cup of Internet. And Brazil is known for soccer and its love for football. And this has presence from all the 193 countries. It had presence from the private sector, and we were deliberating upon some of the biggest issues facing us today, that as nation states, can we come together and agree on some norms which may be non-binding, but we will not attack each other's critical infrastructure. We will make sure that the same kind of humanitarian values that you attach to, say, hospitals in a state of war would be treated, the critical infrastructure for these countries, and especially developing countries, island-locked countries, smaller nations, would be treated with as much care. This is where you learn that there are actually 21 different kinds of rough consensus. If we can, with all our varied interests, even create common minimum programs. And this is a term that I learned from the early 90s when we were a government full of coalition governments. So while you're fighting with all your might, with everything that you've got on many issues, and you disagree vehemently on some issues, can we together as industry, as civil society, as media, as academia, work with the government and empower the government with the knowledge and research that we have created, and genuinely put our heads and our hearts together that we are working towards a common purpose, which is the $5 trillion economy dream that we're chasing for India. And we will do that with the consciousness and sensitivity that how do you now build the stacks, or how do you then build the layers? Just as India's created the India stack, which unlocked so much value for all the startups, just as India created the DigiLocker, which allows you to seamlessly put your documents in one place and not have to worry about ye meri degree hai ya mark sheet hai ya license hai aur ye chori ho jayega. All you have is access, which works seamlessly across devices. Then you've seen the biggest experiment in Aadhaar, and Aadhaar, believe me, has had its issues. Aadhaar, there have been valid concerns related to privacy, related related to how do you store such a vast amount of data in a single place. But we have learned to evolve. And India became, earlier in July, the second nation only after the US to distribute 20 crore vaccines. How were we able to do that? I'm going to, layer my intervention with a small story that one of the most prolific bureaucrats of our time, who's now the present Secretary of Defense, told me. When the tsunami happened in the coastal belt, they gave fishermen GPSs to find their way back. In India, what the fishermen did were they used those GPSs to mark the spot where the maximum catch of fish was. We're a nation full of jugaad. We're a nation full of frugal innovation. We understand the potential of technology. All that we have to do is get us the right opportunities, give us a framework that does not kill what we're trying to solve for. And this is the larger context. There are many dimensions. And this is something that, as you can tell, I'm very, very passionate about. So just like the introduction, I could go on till the end of the day. But given the paucity of time, my high level intervention is one, have a central framework that is forward looking. You can't solve for everything. We should not try to solve for everything with one legislation, because as we learned earlier this day, that it will have impact across ministries, across dimensions, and on existing laws. But what we need to encourage, just as one of the big fours were involved in creating an ease of doing business index where states now compete on it, can we look at creating a digital readiness index where states compete on who is most ready, both in terms of infrastructure support and a mindset support, that, hey, I'm here to work with organizations and I'm not going to treat them as people who are out to do bad. I'm going to treat them as people who are trying to solve for something, and I'll give them the ecosystem and have the current provisions in the law which address some of those questions. And believe me, there are laws that exist, whether it is cheating, whether it is fraud, whether it is transactions that may not be what they seem to be. We have a legal system in place. So one, we need to steer clear of avoiding duplication. Second, we need to make sure that we encourage, as our Prime Minister likes to say, cooperative and competitive federalism. So if my state, which is Uttar Pradesh, becomes the best state in the country that is trying to put out, let's say, 4 markers or policies where we created IT parks, and similarly now gaming is a very hot topic. So we're currently at $3.8 billion US. We can be $35.9 billion in the next 2 years if we are able to create a progressive legislatory framework. And those are some of the kind of future tech businesses that internet is going to come up with. So as the industry is creative, the government will also need to be a little more innovative, nimble-footed, and be willing to seize the opportunity, wearing the hat of a CEO, instead of saying that, hey, I will inherently say, how do I put in first the obligatory framework? So not the burden of compliance, but the proof of goodwill and the proof of excellence is what we need to start working towards. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Shubhi. I was trying to take notes, but then I gave up halfway because I think you covered so many topics. But as you quoted the argumentative Indian as Amartya Sen say, and you talked about that, we need a state level index. I would refer to you next time as Dr. Shubhi says, that we are a competitive Indian, not just argumentative Indian. But I think I like that way of how do you create a healthy competition for people to work towards a better outcome. Again, without losing much time, let me turn to Vishal. Vishal, you're the one who's actually been powering a number of enterprises as well as public organization to become a lot more data sensitive and secure. What are some of your recommendations from on-ground practical perspective?
Hi, thanks, Akhilesh. And just before I jump into your question, it's an honor to be part of the panel here. Obviously, Dr. Gulshan Rai is here as well, and it's a pleasure to be in this company. I think I'll just carry on with a couple of discussions we've had over the last few days, Akhilesh. I think one thing which is very paramount today from an organizer, from an industry, is that it's extremely different today. Even I can give you a stat. I think the CEO of Google said this in 2000, from the beginning of internet till 2016, the amount of data that was captured, 2017 alone had enough data to overtake that. So in terms of just the quantum that we're looking at and the amount of unstructured data that we actually have in terms of emails, audio files, video files, text messages, on and on and on, I think it's extremely important to have a nuanced view so that the regulatory doesn't create a very high burden for organizations. It doesn't set a standard so high that the ongoing cost of actually meeting compliance far outweighs the benefit or an organization's ability to actually run a profitable business and let them focus on their core business. I think a very big stat, which at least I didn't know, that Dr. Subi said, about nearly just under $4 billion is the gaming industry. Now, if you set a framework where these guys are burdened with so many policies that they are actually not able to even focus on their core business, I think that's a definite concern which would come out from here. But besides that, I think, and I say this because we are a beneficiary as well. I like Dr. Subi's idea of having a framework, but I think RBI has done a very, very good job of setting up frameworks based on your size for a bank, and I think that's a model which is very important for other industries to follow, and for central government as a whole. Whether it's certain ministries who are responsible for critical infrastructure like the energy and utilities and other areas. And I think setting up of this policy is extremely important and mighty as well, because that is what will decide what's the extent of their investment, so that their ongoing costs are restricted, but they're also very clear in terms of what they actually need to deliver to make sure they meet a central compliance. And obviously, very important, I think all of us have mentioned this, it's going to be an iterative process. I don't think the process today can simply be just put a policy in place and it's going to survive forever. Compliance requires people, process, technology. If technology is going to change and it's going to keep evolving, I think the processes have to, the policy has to, and the other part, I think, which is extremely important from all this is, all of this requires a lot of people. And today, when we're looking at bring our Data Privacy Act, I think what's very important is what are we actually doing to enable the next generation to actually come in from out of college, out of or through, to actually educate them on this, to actually have a worldview on it, and more importantly, I think for us as Indian IT companies, what's very important is how do we take the policies that we have in India and how do we make money out of it globally. I think that's a very important part of our business, which is being able to replicate the success that we have outside India. And so creating a common benchmark is also very important, because if our policies are completely out of line with what's there globally, I think that will hurt the competitiveness of Indian companies to actually replicate the success that we have in India. And a lot of companies, whether it's the largest IT company in India, they set up the entire core banking for SBI, and that knowledge allowed them to go set it up in different parts of the world. So it's very important that our processes are in line with the global ones as well. So
thank you, Vishal. Again, a very useful perspective. Let me just quickly turn to Mr. Bhardwaj. What are your initial thoughts about this topic about TSL?
Thank you, Scotch, first of all, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share my views. And I congratulate Sameerji for taking the initiative for effecting this informed debate on this issue, which is actually still emerging. Recently, as you would be aware, that there was a big controversy with regards to India. But as a matter of fact, it's not just about to India, it is about two worlds, whether it is North versus South, or black versus white, or large MNCs versus MSMEs. So, the bigger question is that in this context of today's discussion, use of technology for the advantage of few versus get used to by the technology. So the real challenge is how to make it accessible, profitable to all, and with fair rules of the game. we all know that so far as digital transformation is concerned, all companies, regardless of size and sector, are affected by digitization and related technologies. And this applies just as much to a traditional kirana shop in a rural area as to the supplier catering to industrial corporations all over the world or a small consultant. But concepts like artificial intelligence, cloud computing, digital workplace are not always easy to understand. After all, there are so many ways to use digital technologies, ranging from having just a website to automating individual steps in the manufacturing process to overhauling the business process entirely with the help of digital tools. So there are several questions that are there in the minds of the MSMEs. Is all of this really important for me? What do I need to do for my company? What are the return on investment, kind of a cost benefit analysis? And after data protection bill, there are issues that will be emerging, like how MSMEs may be affected and what they need to be do to be compliant with the requirements that are emerging. And if I do a quick reality check, you would agree that in India, that push for digitization by government through mandating filing of returns, tax governance, especially GST, income tax, custom, companies, etc. It is impossible to be in formal business without adopting digital tools. The depth may vary, but the conversion there is almost 100%. But in the informal sector, almost 70% of entities use basic digital tools, and especially for e-payment and maybe apps like WhatsApp for transacting business. So on one hand, there are new issues emerging for policymakers, maybe measurement, practice, impact of digital economy, connectivity, social inclusion, regulation, whether to have hard regulation or whether to have soft touch regulation, etc. When it comes to MSME, there are 3-4 key issues. One is about inclusiveness, that MSMEs need capacity building so that they can be player in the game, have access to artificial intelligence related talent, skills, access to data, access to finance, access to artificial intelligence technology and networks. Also, need for partnership for creation and co-creation of artificial intelligence-based solutions. Currently, the large big tech and MSMEs are working absolutely in silos. Second is with regards to the cyber crimes. See, especially post-COVID, their apprehensions about digital technologies have withered for sure in the MSMEs. So they are ready to adopt digital technologies like never before. But with their operations are still not digital ready. They work on legacy IT systems, hardly heard of firewalls, and they are absolutely vulnerable to cyber crimes. Frauds are becoming very common these days. This is the biggest challenge. So it's the collective responsibility of digital players to build their capabilities and plug loopholes. Otherwise, there would be a regulatory backlash, and that could thwart the whole process of innovation and probable growth coming out of the sector. Third issue is with regards to the interoperability among platform providers and the portability of MSME data. For example, an MSME using cloud-based ERP or accounting platforms, the regulation must allow him to port data from one platform to another if one is not happy. That would need new set of common standards and practices. Otherwise, he would be left at the mercy of the service provider. And this is largely true for all platform providers. They have not yet set together and formed interoperability and portability of the data. Fourth is with regards to the data protection regulation. So there must be MSME specific thresholds, whether as service provider or manufacturer, they should not be subjected to the same set of compliances. Otherwise, compliance it would be ensuring litigations burden on them and then can put them down. So these were initial thoughts I have with regards to the digital transformation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bhardwaj. As I can see that the range of thoughts which are quite wide, and I'm already starting to think, how do I converge and bring it all to saying what are the few things which we can make recommendation and look at as the outcome. But I want to go back to Mr. Kumar, because he made the core point saying we need to work in tandem, and there is a way by which industry and government can work. And I think he's proven in his roles as he's done. But sir, question to you. Many times I think that while the overall objectives are converged, which means that both want growth, but sometimes the short-term objectives are conflicting. So the government wants transparency, governance, control, order, whereas the industry may want, none of those sometimes, but speed and agility and others. So when you say that we should work in tandem, any thoughts you have in terms of how do we make it real, and what are some of those learnings you can apply, or what are the recommendations you have for us?
Akhilesh, there are two premises on which the entire government all the world over work. डॉक्टर चतुर्वेदी जी, फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल थैंक यू सो मच, आपने लखनऊ को इतना याद किया. आपका लखनऊ में स्वागत है. एनी टाइम यू कम ओवर, इट विल बी रियली अ प्लेजर टू बी ए होस्ट टू यू. Coming back to your point, sir, the basic premise on which any of the government, any of the policy, any of the sector works is either trust or distrust. So major countries believe in that. I believe in you as long as you give me reason otherwise to believe. So the basic premise is trust. In US, in UK, in Canada, in Australia, in European Union, consider nation, then when you go for a document, and the front person on the other side of the desk believes in you, unless and until you give a reason otherwise not to believe. Our basic premise in India is that of distrust. For example, I give you an example of election. You come into the booth, there are 4 different people sitting over there. One is the state election machinery, then there is a central government observer keeping a view on the state government, there is a different force which is coming out of it, then there are political party observers. Every political party has a set of person over there, and everyone distrusts you as a citizen. Even you have an epic, I call your name, Mr. Akhilesh has entered, if anyone has an objection, please tell. Then I put an indelible ink on you, and you proudly display it at every place, but that is an indelible ink that authorizes you not to vote again for at least 24 hours. That is not going to go out. So basic premise of our concept of public policy making is distrust, and that distrust level is there. I was just hearing to Bharadwaj ji that how MSMEs might be affected by the data security bill. He was talking about inclusiveness and financial frauds as a challenge, how to port data from one place or the other in a bulk way. There has to be a mechanism for it. Very true, because ultimately there has to be a mechanism of trust where we can actually decide and derive on how well we can actually believe in someone who is saying or someone who is portraying something of that sort. At that point of instance is where I believe the state intervention comes in. So when you say the short-term objectives, or if I say the short-term objectives or the long-term objectives, well, for me as an individual, my long-term objective will be to create this atmosphere of trust, first of all. And short-term objective, of course, as a government officer participating on this platform, I would say that in the advent of making policy making decisions or making a policy or framing the regulations, my main objective would be how to create a mutually supportive system where participation as well as inclusiveness comes into it. That is what my take would be at this instance.
I once again, I think one आप तो लखनऊ में सबको बुला रहे हैं, शायद मैं भी आ जाऊंगा. But what I like about you is that you communicate something in a very simple and effective way with few words. So Vineet, very, very good. Thank you. I liked your point about you are guilty unless proven innocent kind of a concept. I've kind of sensed that all the time, but I say, all my life, my grandparents have told me saying that, India is a country which is, full of value system and culture and trust and all of that. But actually, I don't see that in real life. And the way you kind of gave the example, it brings to life. I think the only place where people trust is that when they leave their footwear outside a temple or another religious place. Outside of that, koi trust hai nahi actually.
Just to add just one line, actually our basic premise and our basic ethos is of course trust. हम ट्रेन में ट्रेवल करते हैं, ट्रस्ट ही तो है कि हम सबके साथ बैठ के खाना भी खा लेते हैं, चाय भी पी लेते हैं. दैट इज ट्रस्ट. We move around, we do, but our government system, which is sort of a legacy, that still needs to change. आप UK के इलेक्शन जाइए, you just a simple paper and a pencil, and that is how you vote. Just a paper and a pencil. And here you get so many things because there is a trust. यहाँ पर आएंगे तो यहाँ तो हम रबर से भी मिटा देंगे, and you don't have that trust. So let us come with our basic ethos, and in fact that is the point where so many things are going upon, that let us come back to our basic ethos and create that atmosphere of trust.
But you're right, sir. Absolutely, you're right. Because I think sometimes the environment molds you to do certain things, and you react to certain incidents, and that's how you kind of do it. And I see that, especially in the world of data protection, where the value of data is so much. And I heard, earlier it was also spoken that the value of data is so much in today's time that it is impossible for us to not protect it. So there's a protection angle from value perspective, and also there are some implications of misuse and others. Okay, let me turn to Dr. Shubhi, because she's the one who again has worked in various areas, also looked at some of these governance of global systems like internet and some of those, etc., etc. Question to you, Dr. Shubhi, how do you make regulations which stay current through the time? And I know it's an impossible answer to give at some level, but one or two things which you've seen on, I know internet governance is not comparable to this, but what are some of those best practices which we should look at as we build policies? Because the reason I'll tell you what I've seen, that sometimes not having a policy is good because you can still operate, but once you have a policy which is outdated, is worse than not having a policy. So what are your thoughts?
Akhilesh, thank you again. And I want to go back to something that Vineetji said on the panel. I can't appreciate him enough, because it's so heartening to see someone who gets it, and the willingness to be so empathetic as well as so spot on. It's remarkable. As a member of the industry as well as academia, I wish we had many more of Vineetjis to look at every single section, because he's hit the nail on the head. When you talk about internet governance or data protection, all part of the same ecosystem, not very different from each other. And what global organizations, and let me also say with great responsibility, what all governments are today solving for is trust. So when I look at whether it is the sanctity of elections, whether it is, and which is the institution incidentally that you celebrate the most, it's the Election Commission of India. Remarkable. Just the fact that you will go out miles and miles to make sure even the last person who lives in a distant village and forest has had the opportunity to cast their vote. And when we look at the complexity of the ecosystem, Akhilesh, what we're really solving for is all 7 layers of the internet. You briefly touched upon that in your opening remarks. It's very interesting to know that when I started my journey in the internet ecosystem, I was told that here is someone who studied anthropology, liberal arts, and humanities. It's only later that I got my PhD from the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, where incidentally I've explored how do you unlock the potential of the social media and the digital ecosphere for better governance and e-governance services and delivery. And that's at the heart of what we're trying to solve for. But a very, very important question that Anilji has posted today for a lot of us to deliberate is, how do you make sure that this is proactive, this is bottom up, and this is not top down, when you don't want to kill businesses? So to your question, Akhilesh, how does the world do it? As far as the internet is concerned, you've got 2 fathers of the internet, Vint Cerf and Sir Tim Berners-Lee. And when they created the internet in ARPANET and in an academic ecosystem, it was a very conscious choice to say that we'll give it to the world. The innovation in the internet always happens at the periphery. It does not happen at the core. And therefore, it's very important for us to understand that there are 4 core values of the internet. It's interoperability, it is universality, it is the ability to amplify freedom of speech and expression, and it is its openness. And when you look at all of these constructs coming together, there are very large organizations like the IETF, which is the Internet Engineering Task Force, that looks at recommendations. And a very interesting way of reconciling dissent. They do not take a show of hands. It's not majoritarian. They start humming. And if you have a proposal on the table, the proposal that gets the loudest hum is actually adopted. It's not a room temperature. This is not brute force majority. Many times, a lot of us do not have the answers to all the problems. Another process that the Internet Governance Forum has adopted is not best practices, but good practices, where the central emergency response team, which is responsible for your absolute last line cyber defense, will actually work with people from academia and the private sector to say, this is my analysis of the threat map. This is how changes have occurred. These are the number of escalations. And now how do I come up with guiding principles that A, would be relevant, B, would be more palatable, C, would be more agile and adaptive. So when we are looking at legislating, yes, it is the sovereign right of the government to do that. But the ask from the industry's perspective is, if you have now Adidas, which is buying real estate in virtual sandbox, where Nike and Adidas are today competing based on an Ethereum model, which is likely to get banned and outlawed in our country. That's the competition. So unless you're trying to go the way of China or Russia, where you can balkanize the internet and shut down the pipes, we have to solve for a global ecosystem. And that is what colleagues from Tata were saying. And that is what we're today trying to build for, that are we forward looking? Can we come up with a set of guidelines where the Niti Aayog has a very large role to play without discrediting the federal powers of the states, but a central framework that gives you the guidelines, that gives you phase-wise implementation, that has an understanding of not just our aspirations today, but as Google likes to put it, what are the moonshots that are possible? So when you look at anecdotes, from carrying in the same vein as Vinitji of the train, we're taught to adjust. We're taught to somewhat compromise. But this is a generation that has audacity of hope. This is a generation where, only yesterday memes were floating when Twitter appointed Parag Agarwal as the global CEO. This is the potential that we're trying to look for, whether it is the ability to retain fantastic engineering talent in India, and also equally the ability to retain fantastic Indian companies in India. There's, Akhilesh, you're aware, globally there's a conversation that's happening as to why some of the companies may be listing themselves outside. Tax is one incentive, but the ease of doing business framework, where I don't have to look at only saying, do I run the business for only compliance, or do I run the business for its primary purpose of innovation? So हमने सबको ना सिर्फ साथ में लेके नहीं चलना. We need to look at a framework that's valid as a hypothesis, and when you retest that, do you still get relevant analysis? So the kind of legislation that we're looking at, doesn't need to address everything at the same time. And some of it has to be left to self-regulation. So what we like to ask for in the internet world is minimum government, maximum governance. And therefore, don't fix something which is not broken, and understand the purpose of the legislation, not just the intent. And that's where I'd like to stop.
Thank you so much. I wish the world was that simple on the government side. Minimum governance, minimum government and maximum governance. But I think we are working towards that in many ways. And some of these experts here on this panel will agree. I'm conscious of time, and I see a question from Sameerji to Vishal. Vishal, I think you've read the question, but I'll read it for the benefit of our audience, which is on YouTube or other streaming channels. The question to Vishal is, what do you think are the capacities required for digital transformation at state levels? There are significant variations in skill as well as budget. How do you suggest we handle that?
Thanks. So actually, just to take off Dr. Subhi's point in terms of a central framework, I think the central policies or initiatives which have actually got maximum traction, right from the early 2000s, whether it's the mission mode projects or Digital India, or whether it was the APDRP initiative or the smart city initiatives. I think the ones which have got maximum traction are ones where there is a framework in place for the states to do, as we like to say, like a cookie cutting job, right? It's like this is my framework. I have these many users, these many people, and I can just build a model out. And also, which is important, is the funding from a central perspective. I think that's when all of these have taken off really quickly and worked extremely well. I think the challenge which today exists is on the competency side. Do we have the competency to execute it at each of these states, at each of these levels? And I think that's where, go back to a point which I had mentioned, is, we have to build this the next generation of actual cybersecurity experts all across the country, and through institutions, through courses. A lot of state governments today are adopting cybersecurity trainings to all of their employees, as well as to a mandatory course for students in universities, and because that's extremely important, and that will also build the competitiveness and a minimum wage level for these for all of the people and our population today, which is majorly in the 20s. And I think a combination of state investment, awareness, building more awareness, and more initiatives, some which have to be centrally funded from a policy side, which have to be adopted by the state, but at also at the education level. And I think that's one way in which we can actually roll this out much faster and ensure that we have a minimum platform or minimum base competency level which is established in each of these states to handle their issues.
Thank you, Vishal. I think that puts things in perspective. How do you make it really practical? Let me turn to again, Mr. Bhardwaj. You talked about in the past as how we have seen some of these hurdles being overcome, and one of the big challenge which I see is, despite whatever resources and things which we throw at the large organization, I think the MSMEs still struggle to take advantage of that. So in your view, specifically when it comes to staying relevant in the data protection world, because as you see, the industry is relying a lot on digital trust when they work with each other, how you think could be some of those resources which could be made available to MSMEs, and what would be your expectations?
See, firstly, let me say a few words about regulation and the way regulations are produced in India. I mean, working in this space for almost 2 decades and working with several committees related to regulations, I can say with full confidence that the regulatory process in India is fairly flawed. So currently there are 2 streams. One is that either it is bulldozed from the political parties, that they are interested in a certain specific legislation and they will bulldoze it, and with the kind of system we have, where the dictate of the party will be there in the parliament, you have to support a specific legislation or the stand of the party because the whip is issued. Second is that most of the regulations are driven by the lobbyists. So almost every big corporations will have public policy professional whose job would be to get a specific set of legislation inserted into the regulation that is coming up. So there is hardly any independent assessment of regulation, the cost benefit analysis, and we have to learn the way West have, particularly the Europe, has tried to find an answer to this. I mean, this is not a new thing. It has been happening in other countries also, but particularly in US. And it is how to evolve a process of regulatory impact assessment. And that process has to be strengthened, and more so especially in the times when such regulations are coming, like data protection, which is not simply of the era of the emergence of internet, when the inventors of the internet would throw it up for the public good, and this was the kind of stand that they had taken. But now we are getting into an era which is increasingly going to be defined with the new emerging systems like metaverse, which has nothing to do with opening it up for the public good, but is for basically regulating, impacting, influencing the life of the people, even if they don't know, with the help of technology, with the help of not only the hardware, but as well as software, with the wearable devices, with chips inserted in your body. And so people would largely become cyborgs if they are not really exposed to these dangers of the new technology. So the world of the internet and the world of the metaverse, there's a lot of difference between the two, and we need to understand that, and we need to understand the dangers that are coming before us. But that should not sort of you can say, disable us. Rather, I would say that these challenges we need to take headlong and try to understand, first of all, what is happening, and then build institutions, particularly in improving the regulation process. That's the point I would like to make.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bhardwaj. I think as I said earlier, I could go on and on, but I see some of these other people joining our hall, which means that it's time for us to shut up and let others speak who possibly will bring some very different and diverse perspectives. Before I thank all my fellow panelists, which kind of have done a brilliant job today, let me try, and I'm going to try, let me try and summarize what we achieved today in just maybe 2 or 3 or 4 brief items. So first one is what I have heard from everybody, and I kind of believe very strongly, is that digital disruption is here. We just can't stop it. Whether we put in policies or don't put in policies, when it comes to businesses, governance, and all that, digital disruption is here. So anybody who's trying to bring in a regulation which is going to be in the form of stopping it or slowing it down is actually going to make it very hard. So I'm sure, and knowing the government policies these days, they're very reformative in nature, they're very collaborative. I think that we are going to make the policies a lot more enabler rather than trying to come in the way of it. In any case, I always say to my friends that trying to stop digital disruption is like trying to sprint in front of a running train. The train will catch up. So there is absolutely no opportunity for us to do that. So I think that's one clear thing everybody is agreed. The second is that there is no point in developing regulations as well as policies outside the context of the technology progress. So how do we stay current? So either you talked about being in Meta versus just being in what we are doing in the earlier old web technologies. So how do we make it more and more in tandem, as again Mr. Kumar has talked about, is the need of the hour. My hope is that we don't necessarily build the data protection regime purely from the transactional system, because I think that's one of the trap which we fall into, because we are all surrounded by transactional system. But I think the world in near future will be all surrounded by smart systems, and how we deal with the data protection in the context of smart system will be very, very important. As I started my conversation, that to me, sometimes policy making for technology sounds like a marriage of 2 states. I hope we are all here together, those priests and those people who will make the marriage of these 2 states happen. With that, once again, thank you, Samirji, thank you, Scotch, thank you, Dr. Gusharan, for bringing us all together. I couldn't have asked for a better company, and thank you all my fellow panelists for making such a wonderful session. I just didn't realize where an hour went, and we could have gone forever, but thank you so much. And with that, let me bring it back to you, Samir.
Well, that was really a very, very interesting session. And you rightly said that we could have gone on, and it was almost like music to our ears, and the way you steered it. My congratulations. Thank you very much. To all the panelists.